Whakataka ho ki te uru, whakataka ho ki te tonga, kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana he atakura, he tio, he huka, he hohunga, haumie, huie, tai kie. E aku nui, e aku rahi tēnei te mihi maiha ki a koutou, kei te mia hoki mana whenua, kei te mia hoki ho kāinga o tēnei rohe, ara ko ngai tua huriri, nā rātou i tiaki aho. Nā mihi nui ki a koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, greetings, welcome to you all. It is wonderful to see you here on this Spring Friday morning. My name is Kyla Colbin. I am the founder and chief executive of BOMA New Zealand, and it is an absolute honor to be hosting the conversation we're about to have. I want to be clear on what we are here to discuss. We are obviously living in an incredibly complex time that is fraught with all sorts of tensions, concerns, competing interests, trade-offs. And if you have come here looking for a debate between COVID and the economy, if you've come here looking to hear people pitted off against each other, defending their sides, you're in the wrong place. That is absolutely not what we are here to do today. What we are here to do today is engage in a dialogue about what a more sophisticated, granular, response to COVID might look like, how we might need to expand our thinking beyond broad brush responses to become more targeted and effective in terms of those responses, and to embrace more than one perspective on this issue. I want to share with you a model that I've come across that comes from epidemiology. And this model is called the X factor in making evidence-based decisions, and it pulls together a whole bunch of factors and uses practitioner expertise in order to combine these factors. And so what we're going to be looking at today is, yes, 100%, we are all committed to following the science, to following the epidemiology, to public health, to safety. That is an absolute given and iron guardrail for this kōrero. We are also going to be embracing values and preferences, the person, the family, the community, the practitioner, case circumstances, social, physical health, psychological health, and the system features in which we operate, our economic system, our legal system, our political system. And if we can't have a conversation that embraces all of those things, we will be inevitably missing the boat. I think we can rightfully be proud of New Zealand's response from the beginning of the pandemic. We went hard, we went early, we were able to eliminate the virus within Aotearoa. And I think we can at the same time accept that a lockdown is a blanket response. And so like any blanket response, it will address what it needs to address, and it will capture a whole bunch of additional stuff in that net. So what we are looking to do this morning is look at what a more granular response might look like that doesn't capture quite so many extra activity within that net. And to do that, we are joined by an absolutely extraordinary group of panelists to engage in this conversation. I feel really privileged to be amongst this esteemed company. Before I introduce our panelists, I will just say we've got the Q&A enabled. There will absolutely be opportunities for you to ask your questions, to get them answered. I will be feeding your questions through to our guests. So please do use that Q&A. Go ahead actively. We definitely want to be hearing from you. We do have closed captions enabled for this webinar, so you're welcome to turn those on if they're useful to you. We're also recording this webinar and we'll be uploading it to YouTube, and our aim is to get that uploaded to you today. So now that I've said that in public, we're going to have to hold ourselves to account for it, and we'll get that uploaded with subtitles as well. So with that, we have three panelists. We've got Radhika Reddy, Dr. Susie Wiles, and Sir Ian Taylor. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to give you a little introduction to each of them and invite each of them to just share a little bit of what's currently top of mind for them in terms of the state of play of our COVID situation, of our pandemic response. And I would like to start with Susie, who is, of course, known to pretty much everyone on this call, if not in New Zealand, award-winning microbiologist, the nation's top science communicator, New Zealander of the Year. I will just say personally, I've known Susie for a number of years now, had the great privilege of knowing her for some time. And the thing that I'm always grateful to Susie for is that I never get the sense that she is parroting a kind of knee-jerk line. I've always felt that she is willing to say, I agree on this and I don't agree on this. And I think our ability to have open agreements, disagreements is something that allows us to build trust in each other, and probably one of the reasons why she is so trusted across Aotearoa. So with that, Susie, I will invite you to turn on your video and audio, and I would love to get just a sense of what is top of mind for you, your take on our current state of play when it comes to the pandemic.
Kia ora, and thank you so much for the invitation to be involved in this panel. So when you invited me, Kyla, it was a few weeks ago, and I was really, really excited because I really did want to discuss, how did we transition from this, very hard elimination approach that we've been following to more of a suppression approach where, we do get to do more of the things that we need to do, but still focus on saving lives. And for me, the time that we did that transition, I had two really hard, criteria for when I thought was the right time. And those two criteria were not having COVID in the community and having our children vaccinated. So having a vaccine available for our under 12s. And, the science on that's progressing really well. And so it looked like that was going to happen, sometime early next year. And so that was kind of my hard, we will not be ready, I don't think, until next year. And the modeling really clearly shows that without 90% of our over fives being vaccinated, we will see deaths and infections that we have not seen here in New Zealand, but have been, normal overseas. And then the past 2 weeks have happened. And, obviously we're in a Delta outbreak. I guess over the last couple of weeks, it's been really clear, it's become clearer that the virus has moved out of those communities who pay attention to the alert level guidelines and rules, and into marginalized communities who don't, who for lots of different reasons either can't follow rules or don't follow rules, all of which are perfectly, are reasons we know about, right? Are based on colonialism, are based on inequity, are based on all sorts of things, are based on the things that many societies around the world have got wrong over time and got more and more wrong over time, and actually have been the things that we've seen during the pandemic get even worse. And that's been really heartbreaking, because once the virus gets into communities like that, once you only hear about a case because someone is so ill that they've turned up in hospital, then it's very, very hard to put the genie back in the bottle, right? And so I've spent the last couple of weeks, thinking, reflecting on what that's going to mean for us. And so when the Prime Minister announced, rather than a move up to level 4, that she was actually starting to lower some of the restrictions, again, in a very evidence-based way, which are the restrictions we actually don't need because they aren't contributing, to actually stopping transmission. It was a real, I guess, a real acknowledgement for me that what I thought about where the virus was transmitting and what that meant for us was actually what was happening, right? And so what the government are trying to do is keep social cohesion, keep the virus low while we ramp up our vaccination rates. But I know that those rates are never going to be enough to protect us the way we need to be protecting, because we do not yet have a vaccine for our under 12s. And so I've been grieving for the life that we've had, right? And so what I feel now is really interesting, because I feel really sad and anxious, and I feel exactly like I did in February, March last year. And so, you know, I had been following the pandemic since January. I think I did my first media interview towards the middle of January or something. And I remember in February, March, watching what was happening in in Italy, watching what's happening in China, and thinking, oh my God, we are going to be utterly wiped out. And that comes because I study infectious diseases. And I'm an immigrant to New Zealand. I married a New Zealander. My experience of New Zealand before I moved here 10 years ago was of coming for holidays, of very privileged Pākehā life. And then when I moved here and started learning about the diseases that I study and how they impact on Aotearoa, that was when I started to learn about inequality here, you know, and the fact that the diseases that I study, we have higher rates than most countries in the developed world, right? So I started to understand more about the society that we have here. And all I could think was, oh my God, this is going to hit us really hard, and it's going to hit those communities that are already marginalized. And yet I would, you know, wander around and it was like nobody else knew what was going on, even though we could see what was happening in Italy and everywhere. And so that's how I feel now. I feel like, you know, I'm hearing opinion pieces from people in the South Island saying, we want to open up, we want to do our events with thousands and thousands of people. And all I can think is, you have no idea what's coming. And so I'm sad and back to not sleeping very well again. And really hoping that we can get our vaccination rates high, but that we can do everything that we can to try and protect people, because the next few months are going to be really, really hard, and people don't understand that yet, I don't think.
Susie, so much in what you've just shared, and the two things that I really want to highlight in there. Number one, the how critical equity is to this conversation. That if we're having this conversation without looking at it through a lens of equity, what we are effectively saying is that some lives are dispensable, and to be able to keep that equity conversation front and center, recognizing that that doesn't make the conversation simple or easy, right? That it actually makes it more challenging, but it also is much like following the science and the epidemiology are iron rails for where we want this conversation to go. I would add that, you know, keeping an equity lens is another iron rail for us to stay focused on. The other thing
Can I just say before you cut me off and move to the next one, the one thing that's been really important, and I don't think people understand well, is that Te Pūnaha Matatini, who have been one of the teams doing the modeling here, they've had an equity lens put on their modeling since the very beginning. So the stats that they come up with for New Zealand are the stats based on New Zealand. They're not based on models that are based on other countries. They are based on the people we have here, the inequities we have here. And so sometimes when our numbers look really different and people go, oh, well, in Australia, they're saying this, or in the UK, they're saying that, it's because our numbers are about our population and our situation. And I think for the vast majority of New Zealanders, they just have no concept of what things are like for many of our communities. And so, yeah, that equity lens, if we don't come out of this with that equity lens on it, we will have failed, and we will be setting ourselves up for even more, you know, for even worse things in the future. And it doesn't have to be that way, is, I guess, my ray of hope. You know, my ray of sunshine is it doesn't have to be that way. We've already shown by thinking of each other in this collective way, we can do better. And we should keep that going forward, I think.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. The other thing I wanted to pick up on from your korero was just the fact that you spoke about feelings, and the fact that you spoke about feeling, you know, scared and anxious and that grief. And I want to acknowledge, you know, we are all feeling machines that think. And so when we look at how do we respond to this, how do we engage in the conversation, again, much like with equity, I think we have to acknowledge every single person tuning in today will be having a whole range of feelings about all of this, feelings of sadness, of fear, of grief, of powerlessness, of frustration, of, disempowerment, this whole kind of gamut of anger. Anger at the virus. How dare you, virus, right? And so just being able to sit with those feelings and recognize them as actually a really fundamental and critical part of our response and how we think about how we engage with each other, I think is super important. So thank you for acknowledging your feelings there as well. Right, we have an hour and a half together, team. So we have another hour and 15 minutes. It will go quickly, but we're going to bring our next panelist into the dialogue. Sir Ian Taylor also will be known to many of you. He has been reasonably vocal as an advocate for the inclusion of insights, innovation, and improvement on the models that we're using in the decision making. I've also had the pleasure of knowing Ian for many years now, and Ian, I will say, has challenged me to really begin to think more critically and more granularly about my own kind of blanket perception on how we need to respond and what could work and what couldn't. And so with that, he's bringing his experience not only as obviously one of our most successful entrepreneurs, but also his experience working with his team and teams around the world, having to apply substantive protocols to keep himself and his teams safe. And so with that, Ian, it's such a pleasure to see you always. Really keen to hear your take on our current situation.
Morena Carla, thank you very much for that. I want to start with the Māori whakatauki. It's ko ngā tahua o tapawai e nānahi hei to ira ora mō apopo, which translated means the footsteps we lay down in our past create the paving stones of where we stand today. And it's an interesting, and the cool thing about that, or the important thing about that, is the footsteps are always in front of you. So as I sit here today, I can look out to January 2020, and I remember flying through London Airport on my way to Abu Dhabi. And I picked up this newspaper, and on page 8, there was a story about a man who had died in a place called Wuhan in China that I'd never heard of, and had died of some disease that it seemed no one else had heard of either. And I took that paper with me. I wish I still had it. I took it with me to Abu Dhabi, and I took it in to the TV compound where the guys had already set up, and I put it on the table, and I remember saying, I wonder when this story will be on page 1. And it didn't take very long. So now I jump forward. It's now March 13, and I'm in Ponte Vedra with 9 of my team, and we're about to do the world's first, our first big major golf tournament. We'd managed to get the Thursday past. We'd just done Thursday. On Thursday night, the rest of the tournament had been closed, so that tournament was closed. By Friday morning, the entire tour had been closed, and we were on planes back to New Zealand. Now, it was interesting at that time because the government, I think, had suggested that people better get home fast before they put people in lockdown. So we came home, 9 of us, came home, flew into our office here, into the airport here in Dunedin, to find that our management team of Cheryl, Liz, and Ali had actually jumped that gun and had already hired 3 Airbnbs. This is how seriously they took it. 3 Airbnbs, and 4 in each of those. And because I was over 70, I was in one of my own. That was the kind of thinking now, as I was furious at the time, but I look back at those footsteps, and it is why we are standing where we are today. That team, that management team of ours, took this seriously from day one. So we gathered together for a meeting in the garage downstairs with the team that had just come back, about 50 meters away from the rest of the team. And that was our meeting where we decided that it was never phrased this way then, but again, that's the benefit of having these footsteps always in front of you. What we decided then was we needed to save lives and livelihoods, that they were inextricable, and that there'd be really big experts around who would save lives, but our job was to save livelihoods, and we made the call there that no one would lose their jobs. No one at all. We had no idea. We just lost all of our global contracts, just gone to zero. But that lives and livelihoods, or livelihoods, was the thing we could control at that time. So it was the number one priority, and it has stayed the number one priority. Saving lives, there were things we could do about it. So that was the first thing. We were put in isolation. We'd already, by the time I'd got back, people had already been moved to their homes before anyone else had said. So again, looking at these footsteps, I'm really proud of what this management team has done. So the other thing that happened was, again, we divided two teams up. One was to deal with the health and the now, and the other was to deal with the future. And I think if I look at our government response, as I look back at those footsteps, I'm not sure that the same and equal importance has been placed on the future, guided by each footstep we see laid down. So I'm laying down another set of footsteps today. There'll be I'll be on different paving stones after this discussion, but I think that Māori worldview is really, really important. So one of the things we realized was that if we're going to save livelihoods, the biggest risk we had was that all the tournaments would start again, and we'd already seen the borders were closing everywhere. Italy, the America's Cup was closed. We could see what was happening. We were in the middle of it. So it was clear to us that the future could easily be closed borders. And if that was the case, our livelihoods of all our people around us were gone. So they set out designing something that had never been done before. They built this incredible remote system on the basis that there was no option. If the borders stay closed, we'd have to do every event in the world that we used to travel to. We'd have to do it from this building. And they built that system in 7 weeks. And we have done every golf tournament, every sport event in the world from here. And that would never have happened with COVID. So that's the other thing. When you see the footsteps, COVID isn't just a challenge. It actually is an opportunity. And we are doing more sports now than we did before COVID. One of the issues we had, and again, these are the footsteps, was in order to operate remotely, instead of sending 9, 10 people overseas, we did have to send one to America. Well, at the start, we had to send 2, and 2 to America, 2 to Europe. And again, this is about protecting lives and livelihoods. They were fully equipped with the most amazing PPE. They were totally trained in everything that they had to do. And then when they flew out, all 4 people flew on separate planes. They did not fly on the same planes. They arrived in America, and Europe, they each had separate cars. They just traveled separately. So the protocols were in place right from the start. While there was no vaccine, the way we were going to save lives was very simple. We weren't going to let them catch it. And if you come back to the very basic, you can only catch COVID if you put yourself in a position where you can. So they had gloves, they had wipes, they had everything. They had full facial masks. And in the end, it turned out to be really valuable, but probably overkill. We just did the Ryder Cup. And I called one of my, because when we got there, so this is how big business responds as well. And, I've been talking a lot about how the government really needs to come to the bench. And this bench has been doing this for a long time. So big business, CBS, there were 2 enormous bubbles staying in 2 separate hotels. Everyone was in smaller bubbles that you never mixed with, smaller bubbles inside those bubbles. And if one person in any of those bubbles even had a sniffle, that bubble was taken out and the spare one from the other hotel was brought in. There were medical staff on site. There was a trailer on site where they did testing every day. So by lunchtime, you had the results of the test. So, I kind of wrap things up here, but that's just to say that, again, there are lessons that we should be learning from the footsteps that started when we laid down the first lockdown. And I think the thing that disappointed me most was that after a year and a half, we went into another lockdown, 6 hours notice, and the levels and the processes were exactly the same as they were a year and a half before. It was the same lock and shut everything, which led us to this really strange idea that we were already delivering golf tournaments in Czechoslovakia, Scotland, and New York. We had already started. So we were one day in when we got 6 hours notice. So we had 3 flatmates living together who said, oh, well, we will travel down to work and carry on because that's really important. When we checked that with the officials, we were told we weren't an essential business, so they couldn't do that, which, you know, those are discussions that could have happened for a year and a half before. So instead, they did the really, you know, well, it's not stupid, but the only option for them was they shifted their beds into this building and this became their place of residence. And it highlighted for me the fact that we'd let a year and a half go by to look at the questions of what will this look like if it strikes again? And so the other thing I'd say, so save lives and livelihoods. Now that I look at the footsteps, those were absolutely paramount in our approach to this. And the other thing was when I saw the rules of lockdown, only essential businesses, we should have approached that from the fact that every business is essential to the people who are working in it, every business. And what we needed to do was bring task force together to go, right, we also know how fast this transmits, what it does. Here are some guidelines that will mean that you can open your business. And here's an example. Here, everyone is fully vaccinated. 40 staff, all fully vaccinated. Our staff overseas have been vaccinated for a year now. We have 3 different entrances to the room, to the building. They're all locked. We are non-public facing. We have protocols inside the building. Even today, our board meetings, you are 3 tables apart. So, and because we're not in a lockdown 4 or 3, we're able to work. But there would be businesses like this in Auckland who could do the same. Or if we struck if a COVID case broke out in Christchurch and started to spread, maybe we'd end up in lockdown. So where is the value in all of the steps that we have taken to protect ourselves and everybody in the community if the same old rules apply that just go simple, everybody go home, don't come out?
Thank you so much, Ian Tenakwe. A couple of things I want to pick up from you. And the first thing I want to say is I think I dropped the ball a little bit when I introduced you. So for those who are not familiar with your work, Ian founded a company called Animation Research. And this is the company that is responsible for all of the incredible graphics that you see if you watch the America's Cup. And you want to know who's in front, you've got Ian's company to thank for that. If you watch the golf and you want to know where the ball went and what trajectory it took and all that, you can thank Ian's company for that. The cricket, the speed, the arc, all of that, you can thank Ian's company for that. And so when he talks about doing this work from overseas, he's working with, Formula One all over the world, golf all over the world, all of these events all over the world, and what your team accomplished in terms of pulling together the ability to do that remotely within 6 weeks is really quite extraordinary.
Kyla, could I just add one thing? I mentioned the Ryder Cup because it highlights 2 things. So one of the things is I rang Sam Dukas. He's actually back. We got him back because we booked MIQ really early. So that's another issue which we'll discuss later on. But we got him back. So the first thing he said when he got back was that being an MIQ was the unsafest he's felt for a year. The other thing was that when I asked him what was the testing regime at the Ryder Cup, was it still as strict? He said, actually, no, they've moved to the stage where we're double vaccinated. We have protocols, we're responsible for those protocols, and now it's our job to make sure we live to those protocols. We can be tested if we want, but the strict regimes are gone. If you looked at the Ryder Cup, there were people there everywhere with no masks. Our guys would not walk out and join those, but the responsibilities had shifted. And for this whole year on that team, nobody's caught COVID. So I think that's one. the counter to that is that the European tour had a bubble of 30 that they flew over. They were tested every day. They had all vaccinated. When they flew back, 2 of them had COVID, which caught them absolutely by surprise. They'd arrived in Scotland for the Dunhill Cup, sort of went to the pub thinking everything, but they had COVID. But nobody else in the 30-person group did. And over the days they tested that, and the doctor traveling, so this is the importance of vaccination, to Susie's point, that they said that because those 2 were vaccinated, they're going to experience nothing more than a cold. And I spoke to one of them, and, he's got a severe cold. But because they were vaccinated, it was harder for them to pass it on. And everyone else in their group was vaccinated, it was harder for them to catch it. So again, that's another value of the vaccination.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to come back to you, of course. I'm going to come back to everyone here because I've got lots of questions, and particularly questions that we'll get to in a moment about what exactly you are advocating for. You've been quite vocal in the media. Just before we move on, though, one last comment I want to make here is that you mentioned, you used the word potentially overkill in terms of your initial, the initial response that you and your team followed. And, my most viral tweet ever, which has reached 10 million people plus around the world, was an observation that if we respond effectively to a pandemic situation, then we don't see the terrible results of the situation. And so inevitably our effective response, if it works, will look like an overreaction. And so in order to be able to, and one of the challenges of this conversation is we have to be willing to sit with the feeling that we may have overreacted, but at what point does that overreaction become so great? At what point does it actually become an overreaction? Sit with what you're going to say, because I want to bring in our third panelist, and then we'll come back to the dialogue. Sure. Thank you. All right. So our third guest is a huge honor. She's new to the Boma family. We've only just met each other, but I came across her. The first time I came across her was through a tweet thread that she did, breaking down some of the communication challenges from Dr. Ashley Bloomfield and his advocacy for use of the COVID app. And it was such an insightful and well thought through thread that really tackled not our ideas about how, Homo economicus, rational humans behave, but the reality of our human behavior. And if we're going to have this conversation, we cannot have a conversation going, oh, well, these people should get to do this and these people should get to do that, without factoring in the impact that that would have on compliance, on the message to the broader public, on people's actual responses. And so Radhika Reddy works, she is not a behavioral scientist per se, but she works, she's an independent software developer, a public policy advocate, a community organizer, and she draws on behavioral science for all of that work. So it's an incredible privilege and a pleasure to welcome you, Radhika, to this dialogue. Keen to hear your take on where we're at, what's top of mind for you, your kind of state of play when it comes to the pandemic.
Great, thank you for having me here. This is something I've been looking forward to since you invited me. And obviously the connection that we had was over that tweet thread. And I'm glad that resonated, because what I was trying to achieve with that was to do 2 things. One is to elevate a little bit the discourse that we have in the public about these applications of behavioral science or behavioral thinking in how we see what the policy should be as constituents. But also I was trying to, in a sense, send a message to government and the bureaucracy to perhaps pay attention to some of the techniques that they were not deploying at the time, to seek kind of to address the deficit, which is also at the same time an opportunity for us to tap into a lot of the capacity for us to maybe optimize the response in a way that may give us some leeway for example, easing restrictions. And so we see this in a bunch of different ways, and I want to get to that and kind of complicate the issue a little bit, because I want to address this complexity question. And also I'll see if I can bring an equity lens into that as well. It's worth making a note as to how these analyses intersect. But before I do that, just my approach to this topic comes, as you said, from the world of software development. And obviously, many people are familiar with ways that software development applies different kinds of behavioral thinking. People have heard of subsets of it, like gamification and so on. We apply nudge theory in different ways. And so the main kind of takeaway from that I've learned over the years that I've been working in this is that human behavior is very complex. It's very hard to predict. And when you're at the kind of front lines of having to make those predictions and make a gamble on what people are going to do, you get to learn very fast that it's worth taking some time to look at the complications in the situation, to see what the research has to offer, to make your best guess possible, and then also to try to make small bets as you go and build up bigger and bigger as you get validation. And these are some of the things that are not just part of the theory of behavioral science, but the practice and application of it, which is also a prong that I want to see if maybe, once again, in the public realm, if folks are open to the idea of, for instance, testing small changes in policy, limited in scope, pilot programs and those kinds of things, which often don't sell very well when government tries to push those. And I also want to see government emboldened to take these kinds of actions, which are more agile, as opposed to taking kind of the heavy-handed approach, which is in some ways politically safe. So that's the kind of overarching motivation I have for being here. In terms of complexity of human behavior and the application to this particular COVID response, there are probably, I'm going to name 4 different areas, and we won't get into all of them, but just we have the opportunity to look at things through a behavioral lens in the COVID response in at least these areas, right? So we have the case of compliance with alert level restrictions and also compliance in terms of MIQ. There's obviously a risk factor there if compliance is not at where we want it to be. There's a risk of expanding the outbreak or initiating an outbreak in the case of MIQ. We also have a case of behavioral questions in the matter of what we talked about in the thread, which is the COVID Tracer app. We want to enhance contact tracing, and that relies quite deeply on people opting into certain consensual behaviors, which is to use the COVID Tracer app regularly and to scan in everywhere they go diligently. But we obviously have seen that has not happened to the levels that most of us probably desire. And actually the fact that most of us desire it, but most of us are not doing it, is a clue as to where the kind of complexity lies. And we also have the case in terms of vaccines, and this is a really old story in public health of vaccine uptake. We've seen this with previous vaccines for centuries, from the smallpox vaccine onwards. In fact, a lot of the behavioral science that we use now in realms like software, the theory has been derived from exactly the field of research into vaccine uptake over the centuries. So we actually have quite a meaty, substantial amount of research to lean on in that particular case. But beyond vaccine uptake, we also have this new development of a vaccine certificate. And this is a sort of a novel policy that probably most people in our generation are not used to seeing anything like this before. And so we have a lot of questions we can ask about unintended consequences of mitigating those risks that might be involved with complicated, counterintuitive ways humans might behave when they have this option of a vaccine passport. There are some very interesting questions there about how it might not function in the way that we intend to on paper. But then at the same time, I should give a caveat. I'm not saying that therefore it won't work. I'm not coming out here to make a controversial stance and take a position against any of these particular policies. It's just a matter of asking the right questions at the time that we develop the policies and make sure that we actually do the best rigorous research that we can afford to in the time that we have available. There's an extraordinary constraint in the case of COVID-19 outbreak, which is that this is an urgent situation. And so I'll just make a little footnote here to say, one of the major policy changes that would be worthwhile for government to pursue is long-term investment in research into things like behavioral science. And I say that as somebody who's not going to directly benefit from that because I don't do that research. But I value very much the output of that research. And I think that that's something that even many of the groups that are given advice to governments around the world about these things have put at the top of their list. And something that Susie mentioned about how the COVID modeling has been localized to this particular country and the demographics here and the specific kind of cultural traits that are involved in this demographic. The same question can be asked of things like behavioral science. As much as I'm enthusiastic about this toolkit that behavioral science has to offer us that we can apply, we can also ask what the limitations are of that, which is that it's not tuned, it is not based, for instance, on Te Ao Māori, it doesn't take into account kaupapa Māori, it's not explained in that way. And if we're not careful about how we use that, we might end up actually prolonging and perpetuating some of these colonialist policies that we see in other realms. So there's a bit of a caveat, a bit of a limitation on that. I should also mention that this toolkit is not great at coming up with answers and solutions. If you're looking for silver bullet options, this is not how you do it. What this does is it generates more ideas than you would have thought of yourself if you were just taking an intuitive approach. It's a systematic way of generating hypotheses. And then you have to do this thing that I said at the start, which is to validate and test. And that's why that's so crucial and so important. Quite often we'll see not just governments, but also corporates and so on take on things like behavioral approaches, and they'll say, oh, we just want to get a few answers, get a few ideas and implement them and run with it. And those of us who are really into this, like we throw our hands up in the air and say, well, proceed with caution. What you ought to do is actually try to do this iteratively and design on this and get validation feedback. So I named 4 areas where we could take this lens and do this analysis, but just briefly, I'll mention the thing about the COVID Tracer app. For those who haven't seen the thread on Twitter, I assume not everybody is on Twitter, and that's probably a good thing. What I discussed in that situation was the messaging and the communication. So there are many aspects to this. There's a framework that I like to use, which if people want to look it up, is the COM-B model. You might, if you go Google this based on how I pronounced it, you might find 2 different models that are named COM-B, which are relevant to this. Both of them are good, but what I'm talking about is the COM-B model. That abbreviation stands for the components of behavior. It's an equation. Behavior is made up of, in this model, 3 different components: capability, opportunity, and motivation. And we have a tendency, particularly in the public discourse, to focus a lot on the motivation aspect, which it turns out is the hardest thing in that model to influence from the outside. Motivation, for instance, resistance to taking a vaccination, or inertia that doesn't allow someone to scan a QR code, is actually something very intrinsic and internal to somebody. And as a person from the outside, it's very difficult to persuade someone or to change someone's motivation. You can browbeat them all you like, telling them the goal behavior. So you can say things like, hey, if you are supposed to use a QR code scanning app, scan, scan, scan. That is a repetition of the goal behavior 3 times, which is that we want you to scan. What it doesn't do is set up the recipe, the algorithm for how to get from where you are today, whatever your particular context is, overcome the limitations in your way, and get to the goal behavior as a sequence of steps. And what I recommend instead for this communication is that you lay out more specific steps. So this might sound really microscopic to say, and very pedantic, but it actually works. It's saying things like, look out for QR codes. When you see a QR code, take out your phone, load the app, click the icon, and then point the app at the camera at the QR code poster, and then scan it. And then here's the key part. Once you've scanned it, give yourself a reward. Pat yourself on the back, smile, celebrate it in some way. There's a very particular hack that's going on in that process, which is to recognize a prompt, to take an action in response to the prompt, and then to wire that in with a reward. This cue action reward system is how people can not just do things as a one-off, but actually form behaviors that will be habitual. Around this time last year, we had a breaking news story about how there was a surge in QR code scanning because we had an alert level 3 announcement, and a whole bunch of almost 1 million people were scanning right away. But then the graph that was published in the media showed that it tapered off after a few days. People were not able to sustain that behavior. And so the public reaction to that was to attribute it to motivation, the hardest thing to change, to say people are lacking in moral fiber, people are innately lazy, people are complacent. This was the view from the government. Or that people were somehow being irrational or simply malicious or something like that. And Kayla, you mentioned how feelings are really important in this. And that's a feelings-based response, which is perfectly fine, but it's not the basis on which to make policy. Because what tends to happen in that case is people have knee-jerk policy responses, such as if I don't like something, ban it. If I like something, make it mandatory. Otherwise, if I'm a bit more sophisticated and I'm from the 1950s, I might say, maybe fine behavior that I don't like, or give a discount or a reward financially for the things that I do like. And if I caught up to the 1990s, I might say something like, oh, I've read about this thing called gamification. Why don't we do that? I hope that what we can do is advance beyond those kind of knee-jerk policies. Not that they're bad to do necessarily. They might actually fit into a policy program perfectly well if it's rationalized properly. But there's a huge range, there's a huge toolkit of things that we can do instead. So the first thing to do in this case of the deficit in people scanning QR codes, looking at that graph, is to imagine what we want that graph to be in the first place. What we want is for people who have, for one reason or another, even if it's a fear-based motivation, started to scan a lot as a population. How do we sustain that behavior? What does that plateau look like? And if we imagine the gap between that plateau chart and then the kind of deficit that we had, where it reverts to a kind of baseline of hardcore users, what is the difference between that? What's the deficit exactly? What makes up the deficit? And also, there's another interesting question to ask, which is why there are some people who still keep scanning QR codes, even when motivation is depleted for other people. So the first question is answered quite easily, which is that the behavior that is sustained is by nature habitual. So how do we get people to form habits? But it turns out there's an entire science about habit formation. And some of that is the messaging that we were talking about, making that recipe clear exactly what to do, and then rewarding yourself for the right behavior so that you actually wire that in, and that makes it an automatic response. We can bring an equity lens into this, which is that the skill for habit formation is not equitably distributed in society. I went to school here, and I don't remember ever taking a class on habit formation. They never taught me how to do this, right? What we do is we take it for granted that people live in environments and cultures and family spaces where they will just inherit this knowledge and absorb it through osmosis from where they live. And people who experience privilege will experience more opportunities to learn this kind of thing. They have role models around them that have specific kinds of training and education that won't have disruptions to their education and so on. And so we often call this discipline or something like that, but that's a trivialization of what's actually happening. And so we actually end up seeing a gap in equity in even the ability to use a QR code app, even for those who are otherwise physically capable of doing it. And so what we have to focus in that case is to try to empower people to have this ability, not to do the goal behavior, but to actually carry out the habit formation behavior so that they can train themselves to do the goal behavior, right? So it's a multi-step process. And once you start seeing this model in that way, it starts to generate a lot of interesting intervention ideas for what we can do. One such thing was what I said in the thread, which is to change the messaging. The other interesting question is, why do some people keep up that behavior as a baseline? Like, who are those people and what's so special about them? Like, what worked in their case? And so that's back to the question about, privilege and having access to habit formation. So many people just sort of naturally have that. But if they could communicate that to other people, that would be a great opportunity to get them on board as well. So kind of being reflective as to, if things are working for you, that's great. How do you actually articulate in a way that that could be transferred to somebody else? Having said that, I'll put a little footnote on that, which is that a lot of people who scan a lot and say they scan a lot don't know that they're not scanning a lot when they're not scanning. Because by definition, if you miss scanning a QR code because you didn't notice it, you didn't notice that you didn't scan it. So your error rate is not being measured at the same time. So just a little humility is useful in this situation. This kind of thinking is exactly what we can apply to all those other areas of the COVID response as well. And it doesn't solve all our problems, but it does give us some flexibility and some tools to apply in different ways. And one of the things I'm really excited about is if there was, for instance, funding for research, what Maori scholars would say from their perspective in trying to not just apply these tools from overseas. Most of the research is done in the UK and North America, not just simply importing them and applying them here, but what does that actually mean and look like from their cultural perspectives, from their traditional ways of understanding how humans behave. There's a lot of opportunity there in that sense as well. So, I hope this might sound honestly a bit more optimistic than I really am in lockdown at the moment, but I hope this gives people some ideas and some provocations to take pause and to think about things in a bit more sophisticated way when it comes to policy.
Radhika, thank you so much for that. I'm so excited that you've been able to join us. I think you're bringing such an important lens to this conversation. A couple of things I just want to touch on. One is, you distinguished between the goal behavior and the steps necessary to get to that goal behavior. And just that acknowledgement that when we say scan, 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 we are making an assumption that the person who receives that message knows exactly how to do that. And one of my first jobs that I ever had was I was supporting elderly people to use computers and the internet. And the thing is that nothing is intuitive if you don't know it. And so there's so many things that we do every day that we think are so obvious that surely everyone knows how to do. But I remember I would spend an hour with someone in their 80s just showing them how to use a mouse and the right amount of pressure to use to click or double click. And these are things that they might seem obvious to lots of folks who are tuning in today. And we have to be, I think, explicit and aware that we are making those assumptions that people have those skills that are not intuitive if you don't already have those skills. So that was one thing I want to touch on. I want to also mihi to two people. The first I want to mihi to Dr. Michelle Dickinson, who has also done some really great communication around the scanning. And I remember in particular, she made a fantastic video that was like, people people are just saying scan, but we're assuming everyone knows how to do that. And I'm going to show you, here's how to make a shortcut, and here's how to make it quick and easy. And, you know, she really modeled the step-by-step that you're describing. So ngā mihi nui kia koe, Michelle, Dr. Dickinson. And I also want to reference a few weeks ago, we held a webinar with the incredible Sasha McMeeking. It was called The Powerful Truth About Māori Leadership. And Sasha discussed in wonderful, vivid color, the Māori COVID response, the Māori response to COVID. And that webinar is online and available to watch. It's had many, many views. And, you know, to your point about, you know, what does it look like in that context to build that kind of habit formation, well worth watching. So thank you so much. All right, we're going to bring Susie and Ian back on the call. We've got a bunch of questions coming through, so please do keep those questions coming through. We will get to many of them. Ian, we'll get you to turn on your video. Fantastic. I want to start with, I just want to come back to you, Ian, for a moment. And my question to you, so you've been in the Herald for a number of weeks now, advocating for a very specific path forward. And I just want to give you a minute to what exactly is your take on, you know, what you would like to see?
So if I'll try and do this quickly. If I come back to save lives and livelihoods, that was the driver for us right from the start. So that means that in this building I have here, this is whānau. This team is, I mean, we're all vaccinated, and the path we took was, it was not compulsory. It would never be compulsory, but we would discuss it together in the context of saving lives and livelihoods. It took a while as we moved through. And when we talked about vaccination, we made it really clear that if you had a reason not to vaccinate, it would not affect your job here. It would affect the fact that we wouldn't send you overseas. That's too dangerous for anyone else. You wouldn't be dealing face to face because that endangered other people. But we could change the way you worked. We could change the way you did not lose your jobs. And we spent our time taking the people who had doubts. We let them have, you know, they got all the information they needed. And, you know, 3 weeks ago, we could confirm that everyone had chosen to do it, but they did it on the basis of save lives and livelihoods, looking after each other and everyone around them. So when we talk about the habit of scanning, that's part of save lives and livelihoods. Everybody here scans. It's just integrated into everything. And I guess what gets frustrating for us is that some of the rules that are put in place, these people can actually, some of the kind of things that you have to do, these people know enough about it to know that that one there's kind of pointless. This one is pointless, given everything in context. And it makes it really hard to enforce laws when a large group of the people in there go, that one doesn't make sense in our environment. Now, jumping to the MIQ, you know, I approached this, the Prime Minister talked a lot about the team of 5 million. And right at the very start of this, that, you know, I was proud to be part of the team of 5 million. I was proud every day we talked to our clients overseas about what this team of 5 million was doing. But, you know, likening it to the game or to a real team, you have a run-on team, which in this case was the best run-on team you could ever, starting lineup, that you could ever have had. The team we were playing, we'd never seen play before. And we could see that it seemed at that stage, its only strategy in the game was to attack our health. So the starting lineup was the perfect team to deal to that. But now we're well into the second half, and we've learned a number of other things. There were other strategies that we hadn't seen. And one of those was to attack the businesses that funded the team. You know, you've got to fund the team somehow. And it would slowly but surely infect the businesses. Now is the time, and we're seeing that happen. I won't, you know, there are just examples everywhere. I mean, we just lost a multi-million-dollar contract simply because I couldn't send one person to America for 1 week and get them back again. It was impossible. So we just had to let it go. And it's not our call that surely you could do this on Zoom. our clients say, no, we want you here. So the biggest constraint now to stopping that other attack that the virus is doing, which is infecting the economic engine that pays for the frontline workers, the politicians, the teachers, those, now that is being eroded. And the greatest roadblock in that is MIQ. And from a business perspective, again, I'm not one, I've never applied in those lotteries. I mean, our team has, just to see where it goes. But I would feel guilty taking one of those lotteries in the MIQ when I read the stories of people who haven't seen their children or haven't been with their parents or couldn't get home to their mother who was dying. It is just not right. So, but we do have to travel. We've reduced our travel by 80%. The 20% that we still need to do is what keeps this running. And so rather than take those MIQ slots, which are really, really important, what we, from a business perspective off the bench, were saying, look, come to us, trust us, and we will give you a full alternative that's as safe, I believe safer actually than MIQ. With the tools we've put together, we will put in place a system that takes the pressure off MIQ, gives us the freedom to travel. You know, the 150 test that's being done at the moment, the decisions about who's going to go on that, because it's a limited number, is being made by people, bureaucrats somewhere, and they are deciding which one of these businesses should go and which one shouldn't. That's a decision we should be making. None of us want to travel at these days. So anyone traveling overseas is doing it because they have to. And what we're saying to the government is, there is another way. Let us step up off the bench. There are some amazing technologies and some amazing procedures that we have had going overseas. Not one of our people overseas has caught COVID, and we've been in Italy, Texas, you name all the COVID-ravaged countries in the world. We have protocols in place that have ensured they did not catch it. The thing that is stopping us now is MIQ, because the guy I just got back, he's been a year in America. In the past, we would, and that's in isolated bubbles. He's on his own, away from his family. You know, he's a frontline. Those are frontline heroes for me. They're keeping this business going. Before MIQ got bottled up, we would be able to send somebody up for 3 weeks and send him off for a holiday in Hawaii or send him back to New Zealand to see his family. Of course, you could do it. He has been there for a year because we can't get anybody up to give him a break. So MIQ is the greatest danger to the economy of the country at the moment. And we're not asking for special treatment. We're asking to come off the bench and give government an alternative that first of all applies to business, but the rules that we put in place could then easily apply to the rugby teams that are taking up all those beds, sports teams. They already have the medical facilities to match the protocols that we are putting in place in the test that I want to run going to LA.
So Ian, when I heard you, when we first started talking about this and you were putting your thoughts forward, oh my gosh, apologies for my dog. So when you were first putting these thoughts forward, I will just tell you, I had a few, sorry, I'm so sorry, team. I had a few really visceral reactions, 2 really visceral reactions. And I think it's the reason that I brought in reinforcements in the form of Susie and Radhika, and not reinforcements again, because we're not setting this up as a debate. But what I want to make sure is when we're the visceral reactions that I had were, number one, I want to make sure this is not a dialogue about, oh, you know, business people have to be able to continue to get richer. How poor us, that's not fair. You know, you mentioned, Ian, every business is an essential business. And, you know, when we first framed up this conversation, that ability for us to be able to maintain our jobs, to be able to maintain dignity for people in any role, to be able to have the confidence of secure employment, that's a really that's something that's absolutely critical. And then the second thing is, you know, are we suggesting that some people should get special treatment, some people shouldn't. What does this do to, are we suggesting that we walk away from some of the science? And so what I'd like to do is maybe invite Susie, if you have any thoughts right now. I'd love to hear commentary from you. And then Radhika, from you, I also want to hear, if we were to set up, because what you did say, Ian, that I went, oh, well, that kind of makes total sense, was if we had a system where there were accredited, confirmed protocols, where an organization could be accredited to say, here is what we're following, here's how we're doing what we're doing, where there's maybe a bond, where there's some, commitment to be able to, for the organizations to take on that responsibility. The question that I then will have for you, Radhika, is going to be, would that then potentially undermine the habit forming behavior of a whole bunch of other folks who go, well, how come they get to do that and I don't? Or is this special treatment for rich people? So Susie, we're going to go to you, and then Radhika, we're going to bring you in, and then we've got a bunch of questions coming through the Q&A, and we're going to get to some of those. So Susie.
So I guess at the heart, I totally agree, Ian. And the thing that's been so frustrating has been, as somebody who understands infection prevention and control, has been seeing some of these things and going, oh God, that's not helping, or, that's just silly, everything. I guess my natural nature is, when I see people messing up, I behave charitably. And actually, what I know of the Ministry of Health is that there are many people who are absolutely exhausted. And we just, this is the heartbreaking thing, is that everything you have said is sensible and requires, really good interactions with the Ministry of Health and MB. And it feels like we don't have the capacity, that everyone is so exhausted and burnt out. Like, for example, in the Ministry of Health, not only are they dealing with COVID, but they've got to deal with everything else with a health system that's been underfunded for many years, right? And many people, yelling for more resources. And so I'm sympathetic to the fact that, our response has not been as agile as it needs to be, and that nobody was doing that really important work that you talked about, which is, what does the future look like? Because honestly, they were just in the here and now. There was no capacity. And it's not clear to me that anybody has that capacity. And so I guess what I'm really interested in terms of our future response, well, in terms of the steps we're taking now, is what do we do to fix that? And part of the fixing that has also been letting go of control. Right. And we've seen how badly this has been managed in terms of, rolling out to Māori and Pacifica providers in every way, right? In this should have been done a year ago in terms of getting them on board or finding the organizations and funding them to do the work that they're doing right now. So I guess that's my frustration, is that we have a system that isn't agile enough, and doesn't seem to have the ability to really loosen control to those organizations and people who are the ones who can do that. And how do we change that? How do we, this is not my area, right? I can tell you all about COVID and I can tell you what's safe, but how do we make sure that everybody can be that agile while kind of burnt out? So I think that's the challenge for me, I think.
So can I respond then?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a couple of things that I need to address, and I really have been surprised by this anti-business feeling that says it's just rich people getting rich. Most small to medium, most businesses are really focused on making sure that they can create jobs and keep their people safe, keep their people in jobs. I had a guy come and give me a hug the other day for what we are doing, because he said he'd just done his homework, and if he lost his job or we had to close, he would last 4 weeks, and then he would not be able to even go to the supermarket. That's about livelihoods. The other thing is that the government has made, I think that Susie has highlighted where this thing has gone completely why we're in the position we're in. It's because government thought that they needed to control it when they could have come and brought together task force. It's interesting, the only time they really involved business very much at all was when 3 of those very rich business people paid themselves for planes to fly in from China with PPE because the government didn't have it. They bought all that PPE in, they paid for it and said to the government, when you've got yourself sorted out and you catch up, then you can pay us back for the PPE. Now, that was a wonderful collaboration between business and government, but it was the last. I know now, since I started posting these letters, I have seen the plans that were offered to the Ministry of Health by the airport, Auckland Airport, who said, you're going to need MIQ facilities. The most dangerous place would be to put them in hotels in the city. So the safest place is we will build a huge structure out here by the airport, because we've got plans for supermarkets and things like that and malls later. So let's build that, turn it into an MIQ facility just across the road from the airport, designed specifically with all of the air clearing and all of that sort of stuff in. It will take us 18 months. So when Judith, whoever it was, said we should be building those, the response from Minister Hipkins was, well, we can't do that, it'll take 18 months. It would be there now. And so I think we have to step back from this idea that business are the enemy. Business is funding everybody who's making this decision. You know, at the moment, I mean, we budgeted this year for a loss because of COVID. Actually, because of the technologies that the team is, we will have one of our most profitable years for a long time. We're employing people and we are paying tax. So, you know, we've got to work on the basis that there are 2 things. So now I've heard for the 4 weeks from inside everywhere that everyone is under stress. Now, that's why we have to move it away and get it to another place, because you really start to make some bad decisions when you're under stress. So this one here says, look, this is a bit we can look after. You'll be fighting COVID. You've got to worry about Afghanistan. You've got to worry about this little bit here, getting our people to start with, getting our people overseas to keep businesses running, not for us to get rich, to make sure that everybody keeps their jobs and the economy keeps going. We've got some of the latest technologies now that will ensure we can go overseas and come back. The way we make this really simple to ease the pressure on the borders, ease everywhere, is that instead of mandating a whole lot of rules for us, there is one rule, and that is that when you come back, if you're in this self-isolation team, when you come back, you better be sure that you don't have COVID when you come back in. And the test that I am wanting to run to LA has all of the latest technologies and tools. This is, again, overkill. Over 3/4 of them have been designed and built in New Zealand, including the one just up the road that has $115 million spent on it so far. It's an FDA approval, and it does a PCR. All of our tests is about PCR-based tests. Antigens we will use, but they will be just used daily while I go in and out of my visits in LA and San Francisco. But the major tests we'll compare it with the nasal tests. We'll do this other one that takes 25 minutes. And so this is a discussion thing to say, this is how we can help. One of the big things that holds all of that MIQ stuff up is that the first premise is you don't know anything about the people who are coming in. So you've got to lock them away. If we build a structure around starting with businesses that have to travel to keep companies running here, you know who they are, you know where they've gone. We've got devices that have been lent to us that'll show where we've been. And the only rider for us is that the government has made it really clear that when you come back in and you're going to one of these self-isolation units, you need to show us that you're not infectious. Well, actually, that's it. You get off that plane, you have to show us that you're not infectious. How the tools you use overseas to ensure that is up to you. So I would use the microgem system, even though it's not FDA approved, because it's one of the tools that I will add to a nasal test, to an antigen test, because for me, the cost of getting this wrong when I come back is too big. Businesses have the greatest motivation not to break the rules. If I could just summarize something, and this is about business, and I remember when I was working with Sam Morgan on the COVID card, one of the things that came from government was that it's a really good idea, but this is business. You're a business. I couldn't believe that. But I've just taken a note of Sam's first discussion with me, when he said, we need to think of different ways to do this because contact tracing is going to be the most important. He said, when this, in about a year and a half, this will break with a new variant, with a new model. I've just got his notes. It will break with a new model. It's likely to start in a church hall in Mangere. It will spread from that church, and it will spread from that church hall in Mangere into gangs and homeless people. And the current COVID tracking system will be under enormous pressure, and they probably won't ever find the starting numbers. Now, that was a business approach, nearly 2 years ago, and it kind of got shut down. And we are seeing that happen. And one of the things, alluding to the human habits, he wasn't blaming this thing. This is the kind of society that it is. It's communal. It's it's whānau based. The families and the homes are big, and in a lot of cases, English is a second language. In a lot of cases, COVID apps and things, mobile phones, they don't have, or even just the knowledge of how to use it. So we need to be talking early about what are the alternatives that we could put in there that would deal to our weakest point in our defense. And what have we got today? Gangs, homeless people, and we can't control it. Now, I don't know whether the COVID card, they wouldn't wear COVID cards either, but the idea was that those who would wear them would mean that we could take the pressure off the COVID tracing team, so they could focus on the places. We would eliminate a whole lot of people you have to track first, very, very fast. Everybody said nobody would wear them. We had this view that actually you put yourself in a level 4 again with a new variant that is shutting everything down, and all you have to do to go outside is to drop one of these around your neck that is in the shape of the paddle that says, He waka e kanoa, we're all in this together. You'd wear it.
You mentioned in the vaccine certificate, vaccine uptake, we have a few questions coming through the Q&A about vaccine mandates, and your business obviously has been voluntary, but you've had 100% uptake. Huge questions around vaccine mandates and what kind of behavior or response they drive. And Radhika, I'm really keen to hear from you, and some of these the questioners have specifically asked for your insights about how people may behave or respond if there is a mandatory vaccination for their particular place of work or to do a particular activity. I also have a question, which is for you. We'll stick with you, Radhika, but it may come back to you, Susie, which is if we appreciate that everything that we do across all facets of our response is a proxy for the ultimate goal, which is to stop us from catching and spreading COVID or getting very sick and dying from COVID, then vaccines are a proxy for immunity. And so the question I'm going to come back to you on, Susie, and then we'll probably be out of time, is what work is being done to assess the level of immunity from acquiring COVID as compared to from vaccine acquired immunity. So Radhika, first with you, thoughts on behaviors driven by vaccine mandates or anything else that has been said so far.
Sure. So just at the previous point about running something like a parallel system to MIQ, and would that have any impact on behaviors? Actually, that ties into the vaccine question in the way behaviors sometimes signaled to people who are not part of that intervention. the basic point I would say is that in the event of a pilot program or a study, I would expect the framing of that would mitigate any of the risks of any unintended consequences of behavior. So long as it's framed as, not that these people are getting a special ride and you're missing out or something like that. This is maybe a time-limited exercise, and so it's not a special privilege. It's intended to discover something. I think most folks would give it some leeway. That would be my expectation. As I said, everything in this case is a hypothesis, and so actually doing this exercise is a way to figure that out, and that might be worth any risk that it might entail to do it at a small scale. In terms of vaccine mandates, I think it's a well-studied area because a lot of places, jurisdictions around the world have different kinds of vaccine mandates for different kinds of vaccinations, for different kinds of populations and so on. And there's just a couple of lessons I want to draw out to bring people's attention to. One is that we often have a temptation to say, well, because we want to respect things like autonomy and individual rights and so on, we want to limit a vaccine mandate to the least possible set of things that we think is important. For instance, just a COVID vaccine. And just taking the presumption that we're talking about the general population, not just say an occupation like teachers, there's one risk to watch out for there, which is that if you signal that the COVID vaccine is the thing you have to get, people get the message that, oh, the other vaccines are not that important after all. And so they might not end up having vaccine uptake for, let's say, measles, mumps, and rubella. And so this is a documented thing from the 1960s. France did this thing where they had pre-existing vaccinations that were known at the time, and they made them mandatory, but then everything that was new after that point, they changed the regime and said those are optional. And so there was a lower uptake of the optional vaccines rather than the mandatory ones. So it's quite effective evidence of effectiveness of a mandate for vaccines, so long as that mandate is proportional. If it's a punitive mandate, a criminal mandate or something like that in legislation, there's a high risk that will actually turn people off because the inequities involved in that regime of criminal justice. But if it's just a mandate in the sense that in some ways, Sirian was saying about the workplace environment, putting sanctions or limiting what people can do, for instance, that changes the incentive structure a little bit. It tends to work a lot better. So if you have, for instance, a vaccine mandate for just teachers or just border workers or something like that, there's a much lower risk of some kind of unintended consequence, running amok and people having a reactance kind of approach where they say, well, I don't want this because it's mandatory. If you don't want it and you're a teacher, you could just not be a teacher, right?
Can I just ask though on that, is that not a punitive mandate? So a no jab, no job policy, is that not punitive in and of itself?
Yeah, it's a spectrum of responses. So, on the one end, you have the harshest response the state can do, which is a criminal restriction. And on the other end, you kind of have this social sanction, right? And the vaccine mandate shifts it a little bit from social sanction into something a little bit more in the middle ground. And that escalation may well be justifiable in certain circumstances, so as long as you have that limitation scope. But as I said, limitation scope has this risk that you might signal to other people as not important. So non-teachers might see this and think, oh, well, it's only for teachers that it matters. I don't have to get the vaccine. So the problem for me saying this statement is I don't know what the size of that response is going to be. So we'd have to test this with perhaps surveys or focus groups or some kind of validation testing to work out, is that going to be a sizable response? And then is it worth it? Because there's a significant benefit in having a vaccine mandate for, let's say, just teachers, right? That's a major transmission vector that we want to take care of. However, if that means it's going to cause the general population to think, well, therefore, I don't need to get a vaccine because it's not mandatory for me, then that might not be worth it. But the question is just to figure out that ahead of time and not kind of rush into it with an assumption. Having said that, we have this urgency, this extraordinary situation of COVID, and we want to respond to it fast. So it's a difficult decision to make, but as much as possible, I'd urge some caution about those things, those particular aspects.
Thank you so much, Susie. What comes up for you when you're hearing this dialogue about vaccines, vaccine mandates? When you hear Ian talking about, creating a system of folks that can develop an expansion of the government response, does it scare you, or do you think it sounds like yes, this is something we should be exploring? Or yeah,
I'm just scared generally, and I guess what I'd love us to be doing is like Ian says, really to be doing much more teamwork around what's going to work and what's going to get us through. So, for me, vaccination is the absolute key. We know at the moment that even if we get everyone vaccinated, that's still not going to be enough. So we need to do all the other things. There's been this really interesting question around, if the whole, is it better just to get COVID because you'll have better immunity? That all I can think of when I hear that is see that picture of the plane that basically there's a picture of planes that survived being shot in the war, and you see where all the dots were. Survivor bias, right?
Sure.
That allowing people to get infected rather than protecting them through vaccination comes at a massive cost. I cannot believe that we are at this stage in the pandemic and people have not understood that. There are nearly 20 million people around the world who have died because of this pandemic, and many countries around the world that have allowed cases to go have set themselves up for a health crisis they have no idea is coming, right? And that's not just long COVID, that's going to be the long-term consequences for those who've survived. And so I just can't get my head around the fact that we're this far through and some people still haven't quite understood that this is really serious. And it's on every one of us to be trying to prevent us being part of a transmission chain, because even if it's not a big deal for us, it will be a big deal for somebody else. And so it's just on all of us to stop that. The issue around vaccination.
Can we come back to that for just a second before we move on to vaccination? I do have a question there. And my question there, and I see you, Ian, but we're going to give Susie a minute here, and then we're going to run out of time so quickly. My question for you there is 100%. I think every one of us, certainly in this room, and I hope everyone on the call, I'm going to set a hard line here that the idea that we should just let people get COVID is a non-starter. That is not in any way a viable, like, oh, that'll be great, we'll have a COVID parties and then we'll all be immune. So my question when I mentioned about COVID acquired immunity versus vaccine acquired immunity is actually more for people who have already had COVID. So let's accept it is serious. We do not want anyone to get COVID who has not had it, who has an opportunity of not getting COVID. So the question is more about those, millions and millions of people who have had it, and likewise people who are immunocompromised and can't get vaccinated. Like those are the questions of like, where do we get to that granularity when we have the vaccine conversation? So
the Pfizer vaccine that we're rolling out in New Zealand can go to anybody but those who have had an alert or have an allergy to one of the ingredients. It's a very small number of people. And if you've had COVID, the recommendation is you get 1 dose of the vaccine because that will help to boost your immunity and give you better immunity. But what worries me is that we know that not everyone who gets vaccinated, even though it's completely safe for them to be vaccinated, will make a really good immune response. And so we will have people in our communities who think they're protected, but who aren't. And so how do we make sure that we protect them too? And the way we protect them too is by everybody saying, well, I will get vaccinated, and not thinking I will be okay because I will just have a mild version of this, right? Because even if somebody they know is vaccinated, if they haven't mounted a good immune response, they will be vulnerable. And at the moment, of course, we have all of our under 12s who are vulnerable. And we've seen, the Delta variant is worse for children. We've seen in countries that are going about their lives, we're seeing large numbers of children hospitalized. That's just, to me, again, not acceptable. And so I am really interested in this mandate thing, because a few days ago I said, I want to see teachers vaccinated, because to me, the data from overseas is really clear that it comes into schools via the teachers, it infects the children, and then they take it home. And so, we need to protect them. How do we wrap that protection around them? We vaccinate. And so we need to make the vaccine really easy and acceptable, right, for all teachers. And my real worry is saying schools are going to go back in whatever a week's time is not enough time, right? It takes 5 weeks to become protected if you have not yet been vaccinated. So what can we do in the meantime? And there's loads of data now from overseas. Ventilation. Why are we not talking about ventilation? Ventilation, masks, these are all of the things, it's a bit like the Swiss cheese, right? We need every response. We can't rely on any one. They all wrap up together. We do all of them. And so how do we make sure that we do that? That's the really key thing.
Ian.
Yep. So very quickly. So a couple of things. I mean, that's just raised another thing. Ventilation. I have, again, over the past 4 weeks, people have sent me the evidence of what was offered the government. Now, when they started to talk about hotels inside, a guy who was brought in particularly worked with NASA. They said aerosol transmission will be absolutely the killer of all of this, especially in a hotel. They put together a plan for government that could start 2 weeks later to actually reventilate and protect every hotel they were picking. It was turned down. So now we're in this situation. I do want to address just one thing, and that's this ongoing question, this ongoing kind of thing about business, and that what we're about to do is a privilege. It is not a privilege. I've spent most of my life traveling around the world, not seeing my kids grow up. That's how you get businesses running. This test I'm going to run to LA, I will fly on a plane. I will spend my life in a hotel where I'll have room service. The only time I will go out will be to go to Fox Studios for the meeting and then back to the hotel. That's what my team have been doing overseas. We will not put ourselves in a position where we will catch COVID. We will limit that as much as we've got. There is nothing privileged about the position, the thing that we are suggesting we need to do. It really needs to be remembered at the moment, this is still the safest country in the world to be. And nobody wants to go and travel unnecessarily. But what scares me most is that the businesses that are funding the teachers, that are funding the nurses, that economy will start to unravel and we'll just keep printing money. We have got to keep the businesses running and the people employed. The other thing that scares me is that my niece who has cancer, here we are in a city that has not had COVID for more than a year, and the operations and they were put on hold. That's just one personal example. That's what scares me. So yes, I agree. We've got to be aggressive to keep this thing at bay, but there are other absolutely equally disastrous things happening. And I believe in this place, we will catch COVID. I catch the flu. We will catch those things. What we need to do and what we've done with this company is we've moved everyone to the stage where if you do catch COVID, we've done everything we can do to mitigate it, just as we recommend you have flu vaccinations, just as we recommend you do not come to work even if you have a sniffle. And that has become a position of honor at this company when someone calls in and says, I won't be in at work today. It's not, oh, they're not in at work. They get a loud Yahoo, good on you, thank you for staying at home.
Yeah. We're just about out of time. I knew it would go so fast. Radhika, final thoughts from you.
I would like to stay in my lane, but I'm tempted to make a comment about the business premise here, which is that I'm glad Sayan is talking about all these ways that the company is doing things right, but there are so many employers who won't be doing it right, because that is, again, a behavioral question. Think about migrant workers who work in this country, get exploited and so on. There are many ways that actually produces a risk factor that we have to find ways to mitigate. And frankly, the policy solutions that we have at the moment for those cases of labor exploitation are not really very good to begin with. So extending it with this additional vector risk of COVID might be something to really be careful to think about.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Susie, any final thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I think that, this is complicated, and I think pitting us against business is not helpful either. What's been really distressing actually has been to see just all of the unnecessary reckons that have been published throughout our media. I'm not talking about Sir Ian's columns. I'm talking about the columns from the people who have no idea, who actually just want us to go back to how life was in 2019, not accepting that life doesn't exist anymore. And I think that's been really, really unhelpful. And I think it's also kind of been sort of melded with the idea of business, right? So I think you've been done a real disservice there by some of the columnists that we hear from every week. It's driving us all insane. So I just think we need, we do need to work together, and we do need to have this equity lens on it. And our recovery has to have equity at its heart going forward.
And just could I close just one last, Susie? Yeah, this has been really, really valuable for me, and I agree with Radhika. That we have to step back again and look at the opportunities that COVID has given us, take a look at all of those footsteps. And COVID has been brilliant in highlighting things like the immigrant workers, like those sorts of things. It's brought it to the fore. And from our perspective, that highlighting means that we can now look at it from business perspectives, from the tools that we have. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with that? Because it has highlighted the exploitation of some of these people. It's also highlighted how important they are to us. So this, the fight against minimum wages is just a nonsense. You cannot run a business if you're against a minimum, well, not a minimum, a livable wage. Everybody should be paid a livable wage. COVID is now actually lifting the target that goes, guess what? Those nurses, those immigrant workers, those ones there, they are absolutely critical to us. How come we're not paying them a livable wage?
Yeah. Team, this has been such a powerful hour and a half. Obviously, sadly, we haven't solved all of the problems of the world. We haven't come out with the clear answers for this complex situation for which there are no clear answers. I feel incredibly grateful to have had the insight from each of you to bring us all to a place to be thinking more Radhika, you began by saying we need to engage more with the complexity rather than less. And for me, that's what this hour and a half has done. It means that we get to a messier place in the first instance, because it's much easier to have a simple stake in the ground of, this is good and this is bad. We know that we're in a situation where it's not that simple. We know, Susie, to your point, we can't go back to just say, well, our choice is lock everything down or open everything up. That's not on offer. We all want the same thing, which is a healthy, thriving, equitable society. I know each of you is fighting for that, and I'm grateful to the mahi that each of you is doing on that front. We are just about out of time. Thank you everyone who tuned in. Obviously, lots of questions. We couldn't get to all of them. There was so much to discuss here. Huge thank you and gratitude to your time, Radhika Reddy, Dr. Susie Wiles, Sir Ian Taylor. It's been a phenomenal privilege to spend this time with you. Please continue your important mahi. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you.